So good afternoon, everyone joining us from Morocco, and good morning to those of you who might be joining from the US. I am Meriem El Haitami, the Community Engagement Officer for MACECE, the Moroccan American Commission for Educational and Cultural Exchange. And as some of you might know, we are currently celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Commission, and we have started a series of webinars. So this will be our second webinar for the anniversary, and it's going to be about Sufism and water. We have Fulbrighters Emily Hayes-Rich and Brittany Landorf, and the webinar is moderated by Fulbright alumna Meriem El Haitami. I will let you introduce yourselves, and Meriem, you can take it from there.
Thank you very much, Meriem, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Meriem El Haitami. I'm a scholar of gender and religion with a research specialization in the study of religio-spiritual articulations of feminism and gender subjectivity in Morocco. And welcome to this webinar that will explore the intersections between the sociopolitics of Sufism and water management and the possible implications for environmental issues and modern human crises. Throughout this discussion, we'll also be interested in looking at how these intersections give us insights into collaborative and dialogical conversation across disciplines and offer an invitation to explore the multiplicity of experiences and practices through the process of co-producing knowledge. So I'm therefore delighted to introduce our speakers and current Fulbright research scholars, Emily Hayes-Rich and Brittany Landorf. So Emily Hayes-Rich is an MS student in archaeology at the University of New Mexico. Her research focus is on the Khattara traditional irrigation system. She hopes to demonstrate the importance of traditional knowledge as a way of mitigating the effects of climate change in rural, arid, and semi-arid communities around the world. Emily grew up in a rural community in northern New Mexico that utilized an irrigation system similar to the Khattara. During her first visit to Morocco in 2017, she became entranced with the similarities to her hometown. It has inspired her archaeological research into traditional technology and its applications to current issues of climate change, both in New Mexico and Morocco and globally. And I'm also happy to introduce Brittany Landorf, who's a current Fulbright research scholar and a doctoral candidate in West and South Asian religions at Emory University. Her dissertation research examines the gendering of spiritual cultivation in Maghribi Sufism, particularly as it relates to the historical figuring of the Majdub, or the mad Sufi saint. She previously completed a Fulbright English teaching assistantship in Turkey and received a BA from Macalester College and Master's in Islamic Studies from Harvard Divinity School. So I will turn it over to Emily for our first presentation.
Wonderful. So I have a quick little PowerPoint here to help explain the Khattara system. And as Meriem introduced, my name is Emily Hayes-Rich, and the title of my Fulbright research project is Old Answers to New Questions, Traditional Water Management as a Solution to Climate Change in Morocco. And this project focused specifically on a traditional irrigation system known as the Khattara. And the Khattara is unique in its ability to bring water to arid and semi-arid areas of the world where there are not rivers, spring systems, and therefore allows for settlement in areas that had previously been occupied mostly by nomadic groups or not been occupied at all. For those of you who don't know what the Khattara system is, as it's not very well known, it is an irrigation system that allows water to be brought from the aquifer to the surface and then used for irrigation, for use in the house, for a hammam, things like that. There are three main important physical structures to the Khattara that allow it to work. The first is this subterranean part where there is an underground channel that brings water from the aquifer to the surface, and then it is bisected by these wells or vertical shafts. Next, the water sort of exits the underground at an outlet and often will pool in a reservoir where it is then distributed through an irrigated land. And some photos to sort of visualize this first part of it, the ventilation and access shafts and underground tunnel look like this. And the underground tunnel can stretch from just a few hundred meters to up to 10 kilometers long, depending on how far away the aquifer is. So it can bring water to towns that are miles and miles away from a above ground source of water. the exit point of the reservoir. These are some photos of what it looks like when it comes from underneath the ground to the surface. And then we'll pool either in a large reservoir or we'll go directly into a surface canal where it is brought to agricultural fields. And these are what some of the canals look like. They're a very beautiful, intricate set of either earthen canals and have often been replaced by concrete canals. And through a very complicated social system or allow water to bring to the various fields. And the history of the Qanat is one that is not sort of set in stone. People don't know exactly when it first originated, but there are theories, and the predominant theory is that it originated on the Iranian plateau in around the 6th century BCE. And from there, it sort of dispersed around the world through empirical expansions and intercultural interactions. But there are competing theories that it was originated in Libya way before then. And there are also theories that it is an East China invention. Around the world, it can be found in around 36 countries, and each country has its own local name. The more technological term is called the Qanat, but here in Morocco, it's called the Khatara. If you get over into Algeria and Libya, it's called the Foghara. In Oman, it's called the Aflaj. In Afghanistan and Pakistan and areas like that, it's called the Karez, and over in Eastern China, it's called the Kanjaring. The Khatara itself has a lot of importance, not only for the past and historical settlement, but also for the present and the future. And it's kind of within this large umbrella that my research falls. So for the past, it was an important system because it allowed for the historical settlement of arid and semi-arid areas of the world. And so people were able to move and settle in areas that had previously been inaccessible. However, it is not a system that has been completely abandoned. It is still used today in many, many countries. And for a lot of communities, is still the only source of water. However, a lot of communities have been switching over to more modern technologies. And this is sort of where attention has built and sort of what becomes a question for the future, where a lot of communities are switching over to the pump well or more modern forms of irrigation system. These irrigation systems have actually proven to be quite detrimental to many arid areas and have not proved to be a viable alternative. So people are looking back to traditional technologies as a solution for climate change, as for the desertification and the drought in many communities, and looking at whether or not these systems are sustainable and that these community-oriented irrigation systems are often a lot more beneficial for life in the desert. And so my research falls under this sort of idea of the Khatara, and there are three main parts for it. The first was a large remote sensing mapping project that I completed, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the second is what I hope to accomplish underneath my Fulbright, which is Khatara community visits during my fieldwork, as well as possibly working in the historical archives in the library in Rabat. So the remote sensing project I completed, where I aimed to map as many of the Khatara systems across Morocco as I could locate on satellite imagery. So I used Google Earth satellite imagery, Google Maps, and those sort of freely available to me. And the wonderful thing about the Khatara is because it is so uniquely built, it is very easy to see from satellite imagery. It appears as this sort of hole or like a line of wells and holes stretching across the landscape. And so from information I had gained from reading academic articles, those had already been mapped, as well as communication with people who were completing similar projects, I attempted to create sort of a complete map of the Khatara of Morocco. And this is what I came up with. Here's about hundreds and hundreds of hours of work that I have put into this map here. There are around 2,700 systems. And I also went through and attempted to identify whether or not the systems were completely abandoned, possibly active, or for some I couldn't tell. There are around 500 systems in Morocco that I believe are possibly active. And it's these 500 systems that I'm going to be sort of focusing on during my field work. And my field work will involve mostly visits, again, as I said, to active Khatara community sites, as well as those that are abandoned, and focus on how this ancient system fits into the present day, understanding whether or not the system itself is in fact still active or is it abandoned, how many people still continue to use it, is there interest in restoring those that are abandoned, how are people's lives impacted by it, sort of the archaeological, historical, and ecological landscape associated with the Khatara, as well as this idea of land rights and water rights. And this is where Brittany and I have sort of found our overlap, because a lot of land and water rights in Morocco sort of are controlled and mitigated by Sufism and then the Zawiyas on them. And so this falls under the social structure of the Khatara. And the social structure of the Khatara is, I think, often more important than the physical structures itself, because of the fact that it is a community-based system, and this communal nature of it makes it very resilient to climate change and very sustainable in these arid areas. And within this social structure, you don't own the water itself, you own your place within the water. And this is called a noba. And so you inherit a certain amount of hours per week. So maybe 3 hours on a Wednesday, maybe if you have a larger farm, you have 12 hours on a Saturday. And within this system, water is a communal nature and it is treated as such. Furthermore, with this sort of communal understanding, there comes a clash in modern days where a lot of water has been privatized by the installation of pump wells. And so this clash between traditional understanding of water and of the land with the sort of modern privatization of water has made these issues within a lot of Khatara communities, sort of who controls the water, who manages the water, who owns the water. Oftentimes it is done by local water associations, possibly religious orders. And so that's sort of what I want to look at in a lot of my field work. And so again, the hopes for the field work are understanding the advantage of the Khatara in Morocco and understanding whether or not it is a system that could provide a lot of solutions for climate change in people who are continuing to use this Khatara, and also understanding if people want to continue using the Khatara and if it is something that will help in the future. And so that kind of leads into Brittany's talk, and she'll talk a little bit more about the Sufism aspect of it.
Thank you very much, Emily, for the very fascinating presentation that explores the traditional technology of managing water and how that connects to present-day dynamics. And I'll turn it over to Brittany for her presentation.
Okay, and I also have a PowerPoint, which I will pull up right now, so thank you to Emily. And, my presentation is going to be a little bit different from Emily's in the sense that, and also I think actually kind of speaks to how we're both approaching, not necessarily like the same topic, but like sort of like thinking about water through these different ways. And especially where Emily kind of ended within her project is where I would like to begin. And just one note is that this is not actually my Fulbright research, nor is it necessarily my dissertation, as Meriem mentioned, but it has really emerged from conversations and research visits that I've been able to do with Emily. And it has been something which has been like helping me think more through this question of narratives as well. So following on Emily's presentation, I'm going to reflect on some of the ways in which these narratives of water, whether they be narratives of water and miracles or the more mundane, everyday experiences of living, managing, and inheriting water, infuse the history and lived expression of Sufism in Morocco. And I am again indebted to Emily for opening my eyes to these motifs. The first narrative I want to recount begins in the Tefilalt oasis, sometime in the 13th century. The Tefilalt at that time was suffering from a severe drought, perhaps not unlike the one that we have today. And there was no end in sight. Desperate for any reprieve, the tribesmen from the oasis decided to embark on the arduous and long pilgrimage to Mecca. In Mecca, they hoped to seek and receive the barakah, or the blessings of a descendant of the Prophet, and perhaps even ask him to return with them. When they eventually arrived in Mecca, they sought admittance to the presence of an Alawi Sharif, who was a descendant of the son-in-law and a cousin of the Prophet, Ali ibn Talib. They asked him for his intercession in the drought, which was strangling their date palms. The Sharif promised them one of his sons. To choose which one was best suited for this task, he turned to each of his sons and he asked them, what would they do if a man treated them poorly? How would they respond to him? He asked each son this question in turn. Each son was like, I would abuse him in the same way, etc., until he got to the last son, who was his youngest son. And he responded that he would always treat a man with goodness, regardless of how the man treated him first. His answer pleased his father. This was the son he would send. The Tefilalt tribesmen returned to their home with the Sharif's son, who was also the founder of the Alawi dynasty in Morocco. When they returned with the Sharif's son, the rain began to flow down. The drought had ended. The land was able to revive and flourished thereafter. So this story, which it's recorded in various different documents that you can find, and might be told by Sufis or Sufi sheikhs for various different purposes. But the text that I read it in is a collection of letters from a 19th century Sufi saint. And he was really writing it to think about this relationship between the earth and the self, and sort of to create an analogy between the ways in which the self needs to be purified as well as the earth needs to be purified by water. And so when I was reading this, I was doing it for a very different project, something about masculine virtue, ethics, and control over the natural environment. But it was really after talking to Emily that I began to think about the ways that these sort of like the connection of the miracle of rediscovering water, which is not really like, again, it's the saint does not do that himself, but it's like the saint, his or her presence that sort of like enables the land to once again flourish. That connection between the blessing of Sufi saints is really sutured into the sacred geography. So creates the sacred geography, which in this presentation is just in the Tefilot, but can be extended throughout Morocco. However, this relationship between water and Sufism does not merely exist within the space of miracle narratives. Narratives of Sufism and water also spill over, shaping the material, social, economic, and political relationship people have with the land. I witnessed this firsthand in the summer of 2019. That summer, I traveled with an El Haitami professor, Dr. John Shoup, who some of you in this webinar may or may not know, to the Tefilot. Dr. Shoup, whose research interests in geography and development lie in this region, also shares a connection with a small rural zawiya, which is the name of a Sufi lodge or institution in the area. The zawiya, which is pictured here, and all of the photos in this presentation really come from that visit, is named after a 15th century Sufi saint, which traces its lineage back to the Shadhili lineage of Moroccan Sufism. While before there used to be around 10 such institutions in the Tefilot, this is really the only one that remains today for various different regions. And has been quite prominent, particularly since the 1800s in the region. At one point, it controlled some 700 hectares of land within its endowment, which is called its waqf, and that now is about 200 hectares. So it's gone from like 700, this like vast display of land, to about 200. And due to various different, whether it's inheritance disputes or this installation of a power plant, the land has kind of shrunk in this time. So zawiyas, for those of you who don't know, they serve like multiple different functions. One of them is definitely, it's connected to this religious aspect. People who are interested, whether they are part of a Sufi order or they are, interested in participating in perhaps like particular rituals, etc., in visiting the shrine of the saint of the various different saints who are buried here, they will come and visit. The photo that you have here before you is actually a photo to the entrance of the khalwa, or the place for spiritual retreat. So there's various different aspects that the zawiya can have, but one of those, very importantly, is the social one. And this is even more so within the rural zawiyas. So in addition to the religious role that the Muqaddam, who here, this is Muqaddam Sidi Mustafa, and the Sheikh of the Zawiya, in addition to helping sort of guide various Sufi adherents on the path or instructing them in lessons and providing spiritual insight, they also serve important political and social roles in mediating water disputes. And so what is interesting further about this particular zawiya is that while there was sort of a period of religious reform and rearrangement of these endowments that religious institutions had, and most of them became signed over to the government, or sort of there was like things that happen that change their endowments, this Zawiya still has its original endowment despite the land itself being shrunk. And what that means is, so like, he's also, this muqaddam also helps mediate water and land disputes, as well as other types of social disputes that may happen. Today, this mostly means, kind of like managing disputes, maybe over the installation and sharing of pump wells, which they have now in the space, but also includes other aspects. The Khatara systems, which I'm going to show this slide, that this is Emily's map as well, that she made for me. So the land that the Zawiya itself has is roughly going to be in the upper spectrum. I don't know if you can see my mouse of this area. We don't have the exact markings per se, but one of the things that you can see along this border is it looks like there are both active and inactive Khataras here. One of the things that Emily and I hope to do when she is doing fieldwork in this area is to visit, for us to go back and talk to Sidi Mustafa, and to talk about whether or not these Khataras are still there, or that they would still be there, but whether or not they are active, whether the role of the pump well has sort of displaced the Khatara themselves, or whether he has narratives and stories himself of them being active, and what role that plays within the Sufi order managing it as well, since the inheritance, if it is going through the Zawiya, is a little bit different than if it's going through various different families. And so those are some of the questions that we have in our research, as well as for me. And when I think about this relationship between narratives and water, it's to think even more about how Sufism has connected itself in kind of, the word that I'm thinking about is sutured, but that's not right, but sort of like very much connected itself within the land of Morocco, through these various miracle narratives, as well as in their social aspects in the contemporary. And that is all I have to share.
Thank you very much, Brittany, for sharing an exploration of the idea of earth, self, and water within the Sufi narrative. And to begin with, sort of have a question to Emily to unpack some ideas around the use and access of the Khattara. So in your anthropological research, have you come across any narratives that shape the socio-political factors that shape the use and access to the Khattara? Do you have any stories to share? Like, my understanding here is that, like, for example, there's the presence of Sufism and maybe the role of a Zawiya in that process, but does that intersect with other factors as well?
So I think hopefully during my field work, I will be able to encounter more of these narratives. I've only done a few site visits. I did a couple back in 2017, and then I was able to visit a community down south of Marrakesh a month or two ago. And I think one thing that really sort of resonates with me every time I'm able to do these site visits is how much people want to talk about their lives and water. I say, the wonderful thing about my research is everyone wants to talk about water. Like, no matter where I go in the world, whether it's in my hometown in New Mexico, whether it's in rural Morocco, people are just so excited to talk about water. And I think that's, people forget what an essential part of our lives it is. And it's even sort of more amplified in areas where the access is quite little. And so when I was down visiting Ait Hadi, which is about an hour and a half south of Marrakesh, the narratives there, I just had people coming from all over the place wanting to tell me about the struggles they had faced, how things had changed over their lives, and what those factors were. And so it was just an incredible experience. And I think, as I continue my field work, there will continue to be that thing where people just have so many stories about how their lives have been affected. And it's often simple things about talking about how now there's a large orange field, and that orange field has disrupted the access to water, and because there's been one pump well installed, now they can no longer use the communal access. But it's just, the stories I think are the most important part of my research. I've got the data that I've collected through the remote sensing. There's going to be archaeological data. But I think what is, the beef of it, and what I've been talking about with Brittany a lot, is the narratives, is people's lives and how it's impacted by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so here there's of course the idea that Sufism is not just about a God-human interaction, but it's also directed toward economic and social welfare. So to sort of bring together what you just mentioned with also the work that Brittany conducts, or that you were able to conduct together, what are some of the connections that you were able to make through your work, or the work that you're intending to conduct together, and what have you been learning from the process, or what you hope to learn? I mean, you already mentioned some ideas in your presentation, so I was hoping if you could unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been really quite shocking to me how much being able to attend some of Brittany's events on Sufism, which I mostly just attended because I was very interested in her topic and she was lovely to be able to take me along. But within all of those, how much sort of came up about water and about relationships to water. And then also within my projects, how much came up about Sufism. So there was one event in particular that I think we both kind of were like, wow, there's something really here, where I was attending a lecture down in Marrakesh with the Kanat Collective, who's affiliated with the Art Institute. I believe it's called LA18. And they had people talking about a traditional form of sort of understanding time through using water. And I had a photo in my slide which showed a small copper bowl in water. And that is a traditional system in which you put the bowl in the water and there's a small hole in the bottom, and it slowly fills up over the course of around 30 minutes. And so that was how time used to be measured in areas before there were access to, watches and things like that. And as we were in this talk, they began to talk about this idea of inheritance and how water rights were inherited and the issues there. And it very quickly started talking about zawiyas and Sufism. And I remember we both just looked at each other being like, oh my God, everywhere there's water, everywhere there is Sufism. And so I think that was one of the things that really started this hope for our project together, that it seems like in so many times, even in these small just lectures we've gone to or visits to zawiyas, there's been a lot of overlapping. And I'll also let Brittany answer this question as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was, like I said, a lot of this was making me go back and reread some things that I have read, and then also to pay attention more to this connection between the land, the land in itself, which I still was thinking about, but the land, spirituality, and people, and how I guess the Sufi acts as the tent pole is the metaphor that I'm thinking right now, but the conduit for those mediations. And so what I have been doing a little bit just in my own thing is when I hear people using metaphors or analogies that are using water, I've been kind of taking note and writing them down. And particularly as we think about the climate change, it's curious to me if people are using them more to sort of thinking about this climate change itself. And then also thinking about what role they have as social mediators. The one that the Zawiya always stuck with me, and I've been thinking about it really since I visited. And at the time when I was visiting, I was asking questions. I was interested. I mean, I'm still interested. It's part of my dissertation research in virtue ethics, particularly how they are embodied and gendered. And those were kind of my primary questions. But I remember hearing a story about one of the reasons. And so it's actually, when I had the photo of the Sidi Mustafa, the Muqaddam, there was this photo of the stack of books next to him. And the reason for that is one of the reasons the Zawiya still has its land endowment, still has the rights over the water, is because they didn't want to give up their books to the Ministry of Religious Affairs. So part of this, land reorganization and the reorganizations of the religious institutions and putting them underneath the umbrella of the ministry was that each Zawiya would give their books to the Ministry of Awqaf. And when they did so, they were supposed to get them back. I think, some did, some did not. But this Zawiya was like, no, we don't want to give up our books. Like, this was something they weren't sure about it. They weren't sure, like, they really felt kind of suspicious about it. But because of that, they they ended up not getting as much support from the government. But they still maintain their land ties, which to me, is then also interesting to see how that has played out since that happened, where now, for example, they're leasing the land to a member of the Zawiya who lives in Casablanca. But they're still, even though they technically are not like managing the land itself, they're still managing the disputes. And one of the things that the Muqaddam does as well is that they go and they spend time with the various different tribes in the area, and they learn the various different dialects so that they are able to better mediate those disputes. And those types of stories are, as Emily said, something I hope that we can do, even if it's just like one or two, to see what that those their roles as like tent poles or conduits are doing.
I think that the fascinating reflection that comes to me as you are both sharing your perspectives. So what I've been reflecting on is like, for example, the work that I'm doing with you, Brittany, right now. So Brittany and I are currently doing research at the intersection of Sufism and gender in Morocco. So your work, I'm fascinated with the idea of collaborative research and what can come out of collaborative research. So through our work, for example, I find it representative of the importance of collaboration in creating a shift in the politics of knowledge production through the critical engagement with our positionalities in the field through ethnographic and auto-ethnographic methods, and through a process of co-theorizing and co-interpreting data and dynamics. So I was wondering if this is something that you both can relate to or speak to through your work. So how do you see the idea of collaborative research when you have those discussions together?
I can go first, I guess. One thing that I really try to do, at least in the field of archaeology, I think there's a lot of times emphasis on sort of the physical aspects of things. Also within the Khatara system, I think that a lot of people just look at the physical structure itself. They look at the holes in the ground. They look at how the engineering aspect of it worked and sort of that. Whereas I think that what makes the Khatara system a resilient system and what makes irrigation and traditional irrigation systems themselves resilient system is in fact how closely tied these social structures are to the physical structures themselves. And so I think being able to work with Brittany has been able to add more of that, because there's a lot about Morocco that I haven't sort of studied and been able to focus on, that she's spent years looking at religion in North Africa and sort of the religion of Islam and how that intersects with how people's lives are intertwined with the Khatara systems, because there are so many factors. There's religious factors, there's linguistic factors, there's historical ties to the land, things like that I all think are important to consider. Because I remember I was having a conversation with someone at a nonprofit and they were asking how much it would cost to restore the structure. And I think that you can't just think about the cost of physically restoring the structure, because if the structure is abandoned, so is the cultural and social knowledge that is necessary to make it function. And so one example in Iran, where they have a lot of projects to restore the Qanat system there and to restore and be able to have communities use it, is they've built an educational center in the city of Yazd. And so they bring in local youth from the communities, train them in sort of the old ways of not only maintenance and water distribution, but of how culturally the water can be distributed, and then send them back out to their communities to be able to facilitate this process. And so I think there is so much contained. There's a physical structure, but then there is also a social structure. And within that, there is religion. And I think that's where being able to work with Brittany has been really incredible, because I had no idea the impact that the Zawiya has had on land and water rights until just recently being able to talk with her.
And I think, the opposite for me is that I'm like, a very textual person. So like actually I think when I first met Emily, also Emily and I we were roommates together for a period of time, so we spent like a lot of time discussing these things. But when I first met Emily, I think one of my first questions when I heard her research was I was like, oh, that's so cool, like are you going to look at like this group of archives? And Emily was like, well, maybe not. I mean, now she is. And so the both with Emily for like sort of stepping and thinking of the materiality of what I'm studying, and then also Meriem with the work that we do, thinking about just how people are living their lives out in these different ways, has helped me then actually go back. So then when I go back to textual sources, I bring those insights and I look at the narrative so differently, and they kind of like they live, I just like can see them through these very different prisms than in the way that I was like very focused sort of looking before. And I think one thing that has been interesting too is I've been both with so Meriem and I are working on a project of translating the biographies of a group of female saints who are buried in Fez. And both with that project and with this project is I've been thinking a lot more about not just the materiality, but like the geography of Sufism and sort of how different at different period, like both in different periods of time, but like how like Sufism itself is like so shaped by the geography of like where it is. So in Fez, you know, even maybe that things would be more similar like in like the real spaces outside of Fez, but like the Sufism within Fez is a little bit different. Maybe very different. I hesitate to use those very like declarative statements than the Sufism and like the role of the Muqaddam in the Tafilalt. Like there just isn't going to be like the water disputes, for example, as one of them, or like sort of managing of inheritance of water. And so like how that then shapes like the relationship between like the land and these like environmental aspects then shapes the religious expression, I think is becoming more and more important to interesting to me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brittany, for that. And just to follow up on the idea of the geography of Sufism and how certain dynamics can vary from a region to another, dependent on the political and socioeconomic dynamics that are that exist in a particular area, and to also sort of give a little bit more background to people who might be following us right now. Were you able to historicize the relationship between Sufism and the access and use of the khattara? Does it have to do with a regional focus, because you're talking about the tafilat and you're talking about the role of a muqaddam in managing dynamics around land and water? How does it apply to different forms of presence of Sufism in the country? And of course, that has to do with the dynamics that are associated with that particular presence.
I think that is, I've not done like the historical sort of like the very close granular historical work, nor do I think Emily, like not in like this sense as well either. That would be something definitely that if we are able, you know, I think we want to do the contemporary taking people's narratives first, and then I want to look back. I mean, the one thing that was interesting to me, and the reason I paired this narrative with this one Zawiya in the Tafilalt, is it is the exact same area that this narrative is like of the sort of like the you know, descendant of the prophet coming from Mecca, and then the drought being ended. This is one that is circulated, and the narrative says different things in different texts, but it is something that is circulated and that is well known. And so there is this already established connection historically. And, you know, we could think about, I mean, using narratives for history they're historical things, but they, it depends on how you're viewing history, I guess, when thinking about that. But I do would like that to be one of the directions. Research.
Yeah, I find that connection very interesting, like the textual stories or narratives around those sociopolitical dynamics and how people currently inherit those stories and how do they interact with them and shape their present realities around those stories. This is a really fascinating aspect of that. Like, I don't know if you, Emily, if you wanted to follow up on that idea.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to it, not as much in terms of sort of Sufi narratives and Sufi history in Morocco, but one of the things that I have been looking at for a project well beyond Fulbright is understanding the diffusion of the Khattada into Morocco, because there's a lot of different sort of competing narratives of when it actually was first used in the country. And there's also a lot of competing narratives of when it was first originated in the world and where it went from there. And so the main prominent narrative that has been held was that the Khattada system came in with the Arab expansion into North Africa, and that it either diffused up into Spain and then came back into Morocco, or came into Morocco and then went up into Spain. And so there's that idea that it came in around the 8th century, maybe the 10th, 11th, and it was used in the Tafalaut and then also used in Marrakesh. But as people have begun to realize sort of the prominence of the Khattada in North Africa, there's been a lot of work done in Libya that have actually shown that the Foghara system there well predates the Arab expansion into North Africa. And they've done a lot of work using this specific kind of archaeological dating, which dates the rocks in the system itself. It's called OSL dating. So I think an incredible project in the future for the Khattada in Morocco would be go through and date a lot of the systems, because I think that would show a really interesting, again, narrative of diffusion of the Khattada into Morocco that sort of can't be done through looking at the historical text because of the fact that it is this physical structure. And I think it might show a lot of different things, that it might have predated the Arabs or been an Amazigh invention here in Morocco. And so there's a lot of things that people have been looking at that have come off of the work being done in Libya. So that is something that I think would be an incredible project in the future.
And another, I'm also, again, reflecting on the work that Brittany and I are conducting. One theme that, of course, comes up in our research and discussion is the intersection of the authority of the state and religion in shaping certain narratives and certain social scripts. So I wonder how these themes come up for you, especially that, of course, we talk about how this traditional technology can help offer solutions, collective solutions. And of course, when we talk about collective solutions, we talk about the involvement of different communities. So here, there's the role of religious communities, especially through Sufi zawiyas over history, but also as we bring it to the discussion around present-day solutions, there's of course the involvement of state narratives as well. So I'm wondering if this theme comes up for you, the intersection of the authority of the state and religion in shaping some of these stories.
I can go. Oh, Emily, no.
Go for it.
Well, I was actually going to say, that I think it's directly connected in the two anecdotes I told, albeit in different ways. Like the first, which is like establishing the authority of the current, of the monarchy today. And establishing not just the authority, right, sort of like of creation of like tracing that lineage back to Mecca and back to the Prophet, but also of tracing that lineage back to the land, and as like one of the sources that is, allows the land to flourish, being this dynasty. The other, and then in the latter one, you see where the narratives or like sort of like state intervention sometimes, though, like I don't like marginalizes maybe, or sort of impacts is a better word, impacts like the function of the Zawiya itself is also historically and today of like this like shrinking. So for example, like some of the land that was taken from the Zawiya was sort of appropriated by the government in order to build a power plant. And so like that is an example of, and like whether, I don't know if that is, you know, land that had like khitaras or like traditional irrigation systems running through it, or what was the purpose of that land. But I do know like that, so like that is an example of the ways in which like in various different competing ways, the state narratives are very much a part of it. It's hard to unpack or like separate them totally.
I also think the same is true sort of for the Khatara itself as it is for the Zawiya, in that sort of they function best in sort of states that allow for a lot of local control of the water itself, because of the fact that it is such a delicate system that relies on this like areas that have very little water. And so just to be able to manage that correctly, it has to have a lot of local understanding of the land and sort of a deep understanding of the land and what it can offer. And so in areas and in countries where the Khatara has existed and then a state has come in that has tried to standardize and privatize things, it has disrupted the social order, which has often resulted in the physical structure itself being abandoned. So I think, you know, there's that underlying theme of, you know, understanding the like local sensitivity of a lot of traditional irrigation systems, and they require that deep understanding of the land that often cease to operate when there is a sort of a state mandated like control of water.
Yeah, so just to leave some time for questions, because I know that there's so many fascinating ideas to unpack. I think I want to end this conversation with a question. I wanted to ask you, do you think that does Sufism offer solution to environmental crises? That's a big and yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question to explore. What does Sufism, in your opinion, has to offer? I'm thinking in my mind of all the complexities and the intersections with the environment, with state politics, and there's a lot of complexity. Of course, this is not to be simplistic in my question.
That is, it's such an interesting question. And I remember it's, you know, it's hard. I think that there are aspects of, you know, whether it is in like, we look at like the social lives of Sufism, as historically, you know, being these sort of hyper local, more responsive to the local, or like, you know, sort of in between the local and the state perhaps, or also like very responsive to local concerns. That is really, really interesting. But obviously can like be subject to like unjust, you know, Sufis can be unjust and, you know, corrupt just like we all can. But I think that is like an interesting model to explore, and relates to what Emily was saying about this like delicate balance about things on the local level. In terms of the thought behind Sufism, I mean, I think that there are things within, you know, especially if we think of like caring, you need to care for the earth as you care for yourself. Which is a slightly more gentle, I would say like Sufis are a little bit more like disciplining of the earth and the self. But if we think of it as like caring and cultivating the earth as you care for the self and like making that analogy, then I think that there could be a lot of like interesting ways to explore and like changing people's habits in relationships to the environment.
I also think I'll sort of build off of that, which in talking about sort of this idea of coming up with a solution for climate change and how sort of Sufism and traditional irrigation systems can help. And I think sort of with climate change, we want there to be this like one big answer, like this is the solution and now we're going to be able to fix, you know, a lot of these problems. But I think in the grand scheme of things, every area requires its own individualized solution. And I think that you do have to consider so many social, physical, environmental, religious factors when you are looking at solutions for desertification, for drought, for flooding, for things like that. And so I think that is a really important thing to consider, is that, you know, there are these complexities in the land and how they are viewed and how they are governed and things like that, that have to be taken into consideration when you are looking at solutions for climate change.
Yeah, thank you for that, because of course we can acknowledge the legacy of Sufism and sort of and having sort of ecological and spiritual thoughts around the environment. But when I ask the question, it also reminds me, because I do work on State Islam and the role of Sufism within the idea of State Islam, and how Sufism can be promoted as a tool to counterbalance extremism, for example. And like we usually hear the question of, can Sufism counterbalance extremism? Is Sufism the answer to that? So I find it a very interesting question, and I thank you for your answers, because it helps sort of grapple with the complexity of, and I like what you said, Emily, that there's a need for local solutions, because there's so many dynamics that play out when we seek to explore the idea of what solutions can we offer, or is there like one possible source of solutions, whether it's like religion or the state, etc. There's so many dynamics that play out in that discussion. So I'm just trying to leave some time for questions. So
we've only had one question, so if you do want to talk about something else, we could do that and then keep the question as the last thing before we close.
Would you like to add anything else, or do you want to unpack something else, or have an open-ended question? I think one of the fascinating aspects of this of collaborative research is that we come across a lot of interesting questions that represents a process to us, and this is what I find fascinating about research, is the processes that we go through into exploring certain questions. And as we come across narratives and stories, there's a lot that plays out in those processes. So yeah, I was wondering if or not have any other questions or something, or comments or something to end with.
It looks like there might be 2 questions now, Miriam. I don't know if we want to.
Yeah, sure. So there are 2 questions. The first one is, do you have a sense of how common water disputes are at present, and whether this has increased or decreased in recent times?
I guess I will sort of talk about this one. I think that I'm not quite sure whether or not it's sort of an increase or decrease question. I think it's kind of how the water disputes have changed. And so I don't know if I can talk a lot to sort of historical water disputes, because I haven't read a lot about that. And I know that there's a lot of interesting laws, specifically in Morocco, that were sort of created to govern that. But I remember when, again, I was down in Ait Hadi, and they were talking about sort of one of the big issues with the water there is there used to be 2 very large spring systems, which a giant sort of a Sekiat system or Targa system was built off of. However, with the installation of the pump wells, that caused the aquifer to drop quite dramatically. And then the first spring system became abandoned in around 2007, and the second spring system became abandoned in 2018. And there's been a lot of protests in the areas because some of these sort of abandonments of the spring system are a result of these massive orange and watermelon farms being placed in the areas that just suck the aquifers dry. And so there's this interesting dynamic happening between those who are still using the communal irrigation systems, who still rely on that traditional systems, and they just physically cannot continue this because of the fact that a pump well might be installed a couple hundred meters off, and that then takes the water from the aquifer and then disrupts the ability for people to continue using that traditional system even though they want to. So I think it's a lot of this clash between privatization and communal structures and this wanting to continue using things that have been in the past with a replacement of these newer technologies, which are often more beneficial in terms of they're faster to get water, they can produce a lot more water, but in the long term, they are disrupting the aquifers and they are taking too much water. And so I think there is that clash happening today, which is really important to address.
I think that
Okay,
there's
so
also another question in the chat, right?
yes. So someone else asked, and this was a pretty long question, so I put it in the chat box as well, just so you can see it. How has the traditional method of administering irrigation water survived, despite the transformations, especially the impact of technology? And he says he's talking about the traditional method of dividing the water by alternating the 10est water clock, although many regions have divided the water by the modern clock. I know it's a long question. So.
Yes, I think that's sort of my question as well, is like, how has traditional methods of administrating water survived, and like, why do people, continue to use these methods, which are objectively much harder as they require a lot more time and a lot more effort. In my community in northern New Mexico, there is still the traditional acequia system. And one of the things that has continued to sort of exist is this idea that every year the whole community comes together and they go through and they clean the canals. And so it's this intense thing that binds people to the land. And I do think that is just like, that is the question, why do people continue to do this when there are alternatives? And I think that that intense sort of love of the land and the way that they are connected to it, and the fact that it connects people to other people, is the really cool thing about traditional irrigation systems. Is, when there are these alternatives, why do people continue to use the traditional ones?
I wonder, Emily, if you wanted to mention too, I can't remember, actually, you might have mentioned this already in the presentation, but the training, the like retraining of techniques in Iran, and how that there have been disruptions, right? Where some of this, like the older technology is lost, and then it is like the methods are then like retrained and like how that works as well.
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned it, but again, there's this center in Yazd, Iran. And I think there may be centers in other places of the world, because there has been this sort of intense reinvestment in the Qanat system worldwide. So I know that in Iran, there's a lot of re-emphasis in it, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in a lot of the areas of the Middle East. That in Oman, the system continues to be a huge part of their culture, of people retraining, not just in the physical structures, but also in the social orders themselves. Because of the fact that there is this really intense sort of understanding and knowledge of being able to divide water to the various families. And that role is incredibly important. And that role is often, has a different name worldwide, but in my town in New Mexico, it's called the Mayordomo, and it's a very important and very respected position in the community. And here in Morocco, they have sort of those same things. And that was one of the first things that drew me to this research, was the same sort of social structure existing in disparate areas of the world, where the language is different, where the religion is different, so many things, yet you have these really similar social orders. But when those have been lost, there is this necessity to not just retrain in the physical structures themselves, but also retrain in the social orders.
Thank you, Emily. I think we have reached the end of our webinar. And on that note, I can join your last point, and we can end with a question. Is as we continue to fight the environmental crisis in Morocco and in the entire world, would we be able to use Sufism to accompany the modern methods to fight environmental modern issues in Morocco? Which is something you also mentioned, Meriem, as it relates to extremism. So it could be something to think about with water issues as well. So thank you, Emily, Brittany, and Meriem, for your participation. And thank you to everyone who joined us today from Morocco and from the US. We hope you learned a lot. And this is something for all of us to think about. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you.
Thank you.